Have you ever wondered what it feels like to realize you're not at the top of the food chain? My name is Nora Kellaway. I'm a park ranger for Parks Canada, stationed in Torngat Mountains National Park in northern Labrador. For the past 4 years, I've worked one of the most remote and challenging postings in the Canadian park system, monitoring over 9,000 square kilometers of Arctic wilderness where the mountains meet the Labrador Sea. My job is straightforward on paper: track wildlife populations, maintain hiking routes, document environmental changes, assist research teams, ensure visitor safety during the brief summer season when anyone actually comes here. Standard park rangers work in a place so isolated that supply flights come once every 2 weeks, and the nearest permanent settlement is over 300 kilometers south. Most people think park rangers in the Arctic spend their time watching polar bears and taking photos of pristine landscapes. They don't understand that in places like the Torngats, where Inuit knowledge speaks of things that predate human presence, where the land itself feels ancient and aware, you learn very quickly that all our assumptions about wilderness and safety are based on southern experience. And in the true north, those assumptions don't always apply. If you stay until the end, I'll tell you about the hierarchy. Not the official Parks Canada organizational chart, I know that one. The other hierarchy. The one that governs who moves freely in these mountains and who learns to yield territory. The one that every ranger, researcher, and Inuit guide who works here understands but never discusses with outsiders. The one that explains why certain valleys are marked travel not recommended on our internal maps despite having no obvious dangers. Why experienced guides refuse work in specific areas regardless of pay. Why do our protocols include rules that make no logical sense until you've spent enough time here to understand that logic isn't always the framework that applies? Because in the Torngat Mountains, humans are not apex predators. We're visitors, tolerated during certain times, monitored constantly, and occasionally reminded, gently or otherwise, that our presence here exists at the sufferance of something that was here long before Parks Canada drew boundaries and opened the land to tourism. I grew up in St. John's, Newfoundland. My father was a fisheries officer. My mother taught at Memorial University. I spent my childhood on boats and in coastal forests, learning to read weather and respect the ocean. After studying environmental science and park management, I wanted remote work. Real wilderness. Not the groomed trails and visitor centers of southern parks. The Torngats attracted me precisely because they're so isolated, so uncompromising. The park was established in 2005 in partnership with the Nunavut government and the Inuit people who've known these mountains for millennia. Protects not just landscape but culture, history, knowledge that predates European contact by thousands of years. The mountains themselves are among the oldest on Earth, worn smooth by glaciers stark and massive, rising directly from the sea. Polar bears hunt the coast. Caribou migrate through the valleys. And something else moves through the high country that we don't classify, don't study, don't acknowledge officially, but accommodate nonetheless. My posting is at the Northern Research Station, a small complex of buildings that serves as base camp for scientific research, ranger operations, and the occasional guided expedition during July and August when the weather permits visitors. The rest of the year, I'm alone except for bi-weekly supply flights and radio contact with headquarters in Nain. I monitor wildlife, maintain equipment, document ice and weather patterns, and enforce the protocols that keep people safe. Both the official protocols about bear awareness and emergency procedures, and the unofficial ones about where to go and, more importantly, where not to. When I arrived for my first season, the outgoing ranger, a man named Thomas Merkuratsuk, Inuit late 50s, who'd worked these mountains for over 2 decades, spent 2 weeks training me. He taught me the standard procedures, radio protocols, bear deterrent use, emergency evacuation procedures, But during our last evening before he left, as we watched the midnight sun paint the mountains gold, he did something that changed everything. He pulled out a separate notebook, smaller than the official logs, worn leather cover, pages filled with handwriting in both English and Inuktitut. "This isn't official," he said quietly. "Parks Canada doesn't acknowledge what's in here. But every ranger who's lasted more than one season learns what I'm about to tell you." He opened a hand-drawn map, the Torngat Range, but marked with notations that weren't on any Parks Canada chart. Valleys labeled with single words: restricted, avoid, monitor only, do not enter. High plateaus marked with symbols I didn't recognize, and one entire section of the northern peaks circled in red with a note in Inuktitut that Thomas translated: "Their territory. Respect boundaries." I looked at him, waiting for an explanation. He closed the notebook. "There are things in these mountains older than the Inuit presence, older than the caribou, things that were here when the glaciers retreated 10,000 years ago, and will be here long after we're gone. The Inuit have known about them forever, have protocols, have respectful distance. When Parks Canada came, they were told, but you can't put traditional knowledge like this in official documents. Can't explain to Southern administrators that certain areas are off-limits not because of environmental sensitivity, but because something lives there that doesn't tolerate human presence." "What kind of something?" Thomas looked at me carefully. "The Inuit call them different names, depending on region, on family, but the understanding is the same. They're tall, much taller than humans. They move differently. They don't hunt us, but they enforce territory. If you cross their boundaries, especially during certain times, they make it clear you need to leave. Most people do. Some don't understand quickly enough." He paused. 3 researchers have gone missing in my 22 years. All 3 ignored local guidance, went into marked territories. We searched, found evidence that they'd encountered something, but I never found them. Evidence? Their camps, torn apart. Not by bears, bears leave different signs. Not by the weather. Torn apart like something very large and very strong wanted to make a point. Their equipment scattered over kilometers. Their tracks lead into areas we don't follow. And other tracks, larger, wrong shape, following theirs. He handed me the notebook. "You follow the standard safety rules. You also follow these. Don't go into the marked valleys alone. Don't camp above 2,000 meters after mid-August. If you see tracks that don't match any known animal, photograph them and leave the area. If you hear vocalizations that aren't bear or wolf or wind, don't investigate. And most importantly, if you see them, which you probably will eventually, don't approach. Don't run. Just leave. Calmly, showing you understand this is their space and you're withdrawing." The plane came for him the next morning, and I was alone with 9,000 square kilometers of Arctic wilderness, a notebook full of warnings about territorial boundaries enforced by something that wasn't supposed to exist, and a job that apparently required me to acknowledge reality that Parks Canada's official position denied. I wanted to dismiss it, wanted to think Thomas had spent too many seasons isolated, that Inuit traditional knowledge was being confused with modern wildlife management. But I'd seen his face, heard the matter-of-fact tone. He wasn't telling stories. He was giving me survival protocols developed over millennia of human presence in mountains where humans were never the dominant species. That first week alone, I followed standard procedures: morning patrols, equipment checks, radio reports. The mountains were exactly as advertised: stunning, harsh, empty of human presence. Caribou moved through the valleys. Arctic foxes appeared near the station looking for scraps. A polar bear spent one afternoon investigating the perimeter before moving on. normal wildlife, normal wilderness. I almost convinced myself the notebook was unnecessary caution. Then on day 8, during a patrol of the Southern Research Zone, I found the tracks. I was following a caribou migration route, documenting herd numbers, standard work. The trail followed a river valley, easy terrain, well within approved areas. Around midday, I noticed something in the mud near the river. Tracks large, very large. My first thought was bear, but the shape was wrong. Bears have 5 toes. These had something closer to 4. And the stride length, the distance between prints, was enormous. Over 2 meters. I'm 168 centimeters tall. Whatever made these tracks would have towered over me. Would have towered over any human. I took photos. Measured the prints, 43 centimeters long, 26 wide. Deep impressions suggesting significant weight. And here's what made my skin crawl. They were following the caribou trail. Not intersecting randomly. Following deliberately. Paralleling the herd's route. Staying just inside the tree line while the caribou moved through open ground. Hunting behavior. But nothing I knew hunted caribou by stalking on 2 legs with a stride that long. I checked Thomas's notebook. Found an entry from 2009. Same valley. Same type of tracks. His note. Documented prints 41 centimeters x 24 centimeters following caribou migration. Did not pursue tracking. I withdrew to the station. No incidents. And below that, in different handwriting, an earlier entry from 1997. Found similar tracks during autumn migration. Inuit guide Joanna Merkuratsuk identified it as Tuniat, plural of tunic. Said they follow the caribou as we do. Respectful distance maintained both directions. Left valley immediately per her guidance. I left the valley. Didn't investigate further. Didn't try to follow the tracks to see where they led. I just documented the location, took my photos, and returned to the station. That evening, I radioed headquarters. Reported the tracks as unidentified large animal, possibly bear variant. Recommend wildlife assessment. They logged it. Said they'd note it for the next wildlife survey. Didn't send anyone to investigate. And I understood. This wasn't the first time. This was known. Documented unofficially. Accommodated quietly. Welcome to the Torngats, where the mountains are older than civilization, where Inuit knowledge recognizes things that Western science doesn't have categories for, where park rangers learn very quickly that our species' position in the wilderness hierarchy is not what we assumed, where something very large and very territorial shares these mountains with us, and where the most important skill a ranger can develop is knowing when to document from a distance, and when to simply leave and let the real apex predators have their space. Because I wasn't at the top of the food chain here. And the sooner I accepted that reality, the longer I'd survive in a place where the rules we brought from the south applied only as long as we respected the older rules that governed these mountains long before humans ever arrived. Rules I was about to learn in detail. Rules that would determine whether I lasted one season or became another disappearance that Parks Canada quietly recorded and never fully explained. The tracks changed everything. Not because they were frightening, though they were, but because they made Thomas's warnings concrete. Real. I spent the next week reviewing the notebook more carefully. Reading entries from rangers and guides going back to the 1970s when the area first saw regular scientific presence. Before it was a national park. Before tourists came. Back when it was just researchers and Inuit hunters in the mountains, the pattern was clear. Every ranger documented the same things. Tracks that didn't match known species. Vocalizations deep, resonant calls that echoed through valleys. Not quite like any recorded animal. Sightings, always at distance, always brief, of figures moving through high country. Tall. Bipedal. Fast. and territorial behavior. Areas where camps were destroyed if placed wrong. Routes where people felt watched, followed, herded away from certain valleys. But here's what struck me: the tone of the entries. They didn't panic. Weren't horror stories. Her notes from the 1990s described the tunnel in detail. Taller than two men, covered in dark hair. Faces almost human but wrong proportions. Eyes that reflect light like wolves. They're not spirits. Not monsters. Just another person. Older people. They were here first. We learned to share the land, to respect their territories, to read the signs when they want you to leave. One of her entries from 1998 described an encounter. Guiding research team in Nachvak Valley. Team wanted to camp at Upper Lake despite my warnings. I refused. Told them the Tunnet used that valley in autumn. They thought it was superstition. We camped lower instead. That night heard them. Their calls echoing from the upper valley. Deep sounds. Like talking but not quite. Team finally understood this wasn't folklore. In the morning found tracks circling our camp. They'd come down. Checked us. Saw we'd respected the boundary. Left us alone. I was reading this entry when my radio crackled. Parks Canada calling. A research team was arriving in 2 days. Geologists studying glacial deposits. 3 researchers. 2 weeks in the field. My job was to facilitate their work and ensure safety. Standard ranger duties. The team arrived on schedule. Dr. Sarah Chun from McGill led it. Glaciologist. Experienced Arctic researcher. Professional. Her team consisted of Marcus Reed, a grad student, and Amelia Kovic, a field technician. Good people. Competent. But Southerners. No experience in the Torngats. No understanding of the unofficial protocols. I gave them the standard safety briefing. Bear awareness. Emergency procedures. Weather monitoring. Then I mentioned the restricted areas. Pulled out the map showing the valleys marked for environmental sensitivity, which was true, but not the whole truth. These areas are off limits, I said. Parks policy. No camping. No extended stays. If your research requires access, it's day trips only and you check in every 4 hours. Sarah looked at the restricted zones. What's the actual concern? The maps say environmental sensitivity, but I need specifics for our research planning. I chose my words carefully. The Inuit communities have traditional knowledge about these areas. Cultural significance. Wildlife behavior. The park honors those protocols. Some valleys are considered territorial. For wildlife, we maintain distance. What kind of wildlife? Various species. The protocols work. Nobody's been injured following them. I just need your commitment to respect the boundaries. They agreed. Seemed reasonable. We spent the next few days in approved areas. They took samples. I monitored their safety. Professional work. No issues. But I noticed Marcus was curious about the restricted valleys. Keep asking questions. Why those specific areas? What data supported the restrictions? Has anyone actually surveyed them recently? On day 5, we were working near the boundary of a marked valley, the same one where I'd found the tracks 3 weeks earlier. The caribou had moved through. The research team was sampling glacial till. I was maintaining visual contact, standard procedure. Around 3 p.m. Marcus wandered off. Said he needed to scout the next sample site. I told him to stay within visual range. He nodded, but 20 minutes later he was gone. I found him half a kilometer into the restricted valley, following the river, taking samples from deposits that definitely fell into the no-access zone. Called out. He waved. I started to say something about perfect research opportunities, then stopped. His expression changed. He was looking past me. Up the valley. I turned. I saw it. Them. 3 figures. High on the ridge above us. Maybe 500 meters away. Too far for detail but close enough to see scale. They were massive. Easily over 3 meters tall. Bipedal. Moving along the ridge with a gait that was almost human but not quite. Too smooth. Too quick. They stopped. For maybe 10 seconds they looked down at us. Then they moved fast, impossibly fast, over the ridge and out of sight. Marcus had gone very pale. What? What were those? Wildlife, I said. Large wildlife. We need to leave. Now. Not running. But we need to move. We walked quickly but calmly out of the valley. I explained nothing until we were back in approved territory. Then I told him the truth. All of it. Thomas's warnings. The notebook. The tracks. The long history of human presence learning to share these mountains with something else. Something territorial. Something we didn't classify officially but accommodated practically. That evening I briefed the entire team. Sarah was skeptical but professional. She'd worked remote enough to know that traditional knowledge often contained truth that science hadn't formally recognized. Amelia was shaken but willing to follow protocols. Marcus was fascinated. Too fascinated. He wanted to document them. To study them. To prove they existed. No, I said firmly. That's not your research. That's not why you're here. And attempting it would violate both park protocols and the understanding we've maintained with the Inuit communities for decades. They're not research subjects. They're neighbors. Territorial neighbors. We respect boundaries. That's how this works. They agreed. Verbally. But I saw it in Marcus's eyes. He was already planning. I spent the next morning updating the notebook. Documented the sighting. 3 individuals. Moving along the western ridge of the Caribou Valley. Traveling north. Quick departure once we'd been noticed. No aggressive behavior. Just observation and withdrawal. Classic territorial awareness. They checked us, determined we were leaving, and moved on. I also reviewed all the protocols Thomas had left. I realized I needed to explain them properly to the research team, not as a superstition, as field-tested safety procedures developed through generations of experience. That evening I sat everyone down, pulled out Thomas's map. These aren't arbitrary restrictions, I said. They're territories. Just like wolves have territories, bears have ranges. These mountains have zones controlled by something very large, very intelligent, and very invested in maintaining boundaries. The Inuit call them Tunniet. Other rangers use different terms. But the behavior is consistent. They're territorial. They tolerate human presence in specific areas during specific times. They enforce boundaries in others. I laid out the protocols. Protocol 1. Restricted valleys are actually territorial boundaries. Never camp in these areas. Day access only if absolutely necessary. Always withdraw before evening. Protocol 2. If you see them, do not approach. Do not photograph aggressively. Do not act threatening. Make it clear you're aware of them and you're leaving. Protocol 3. Certain times are more sensitive. Late August through September. They seem more territorial, possibly related to caribou migrations or their own seasonal patterns. Minimize human presence in border areas during these weeks. Protocol 4. If you find evidence of their presence, tracks, disturbed areas, torn vegetation in ways that don't match known animals, document from distance and leave. Don't investigate. Protocol 5. They vocalize. Deep calls. Usually at dusk or night. If you hear them close to your camp, it means you're too near a boundary. Relocate. Protocol 6. They're not hostile. In decades of coexistence, no one following protocols has been harmed. But every incident, every disappearance or destroyed camp involved someone who ignored warnings, who pushed boundaries, who refused to accept that these mountains have rules older than Parks Canada. Protocol 7. Trust Inuit guidance absolutely. If a guide says an area is wrong or a time is wrong or a plan is wrong, you change plans. No debate. Their knowledge comes from millennia of living here, from learning these patterns before written records existed. Sarah absorbed this professionally. So we're documenting a cryptid species without officially acknowledging it? We're acknowledging territorial behavior that affects park safety. How we classify the species is less important than respecting the patterns. Every park has zones where we limit human access for wildlife management. This is the same concept, just different scales. Marcus had been quiet. Now he spoke. But if they're real, if they're a surviving population of something, don't we have a scientific obligation to document them? To study them? To understand them? We understand them enough, I said. We know they're here. We know they're territorial. We know how to coexist. What we don't have is the right to study them against their obvious preference for distance. They've made their position clear. Stay in your zones, we'll stay in ours. Forcing documentation would violate that understanding, would put both species at risk. But Parks Canada must want data. Parks Canada, I interrupted, wants rangers and visitors and researchers to stay safe. I want good relationships with Inuit communities. I want the park to function without incidents. All of that requires respecting the informal protocols. The data exists. It's in notebooks like Thomas's. It's in decades of ranger observations. It's in centuries of Inuit knowledge. It's just not in published papers. And that's intentional. Some knowledge is better kept operational rather than academic. We worked the remaining week without incident. The team stayed in approved areas, completed their research, flew out on schedule. But before they left, Marcus pulled me aside. I believe you, he said. I saw them. I felt, I don't know how to describe it, like being noticed by something that decided to tolerate me. It was humbling. He paused. Thank you for keeping us safe, for sharing the protocols. I won't talk about this publicly, but I'll remember. I'll teach it if I ever work in remote areas. That humans aren't always apex predators. That some places have older rules. That was early August. I had 6 more weeks before the season ended and the park closed for winter. 6 weeks I spent learning the territories more thoroughly, mapping the boundaries not from Parks Canada data but from observation, from where I felt comfortable, where I felt watched, where the landscape seemed to shift from I'm a visitor here to I shouldn't be here. The Tunniat moved through the high country. I saw them occasionally, always at a distance, always briefly. They seemed most active during dawn and dusk. Moved in small groups, 3 to 5 individuals. The same groups, I thought, based on recognizable patterns. One group had a noticeably larger individual. Another moved with one that seemed younger, smaller. Family groups, perhaps. Or hunting parties. Impossible to know. But I noticed their respect was conditional, reciprocal. When I stayed in approved areas, they ignored me. When I got too close to boundaries, even accidentally, they appeared, watching from ridges, making their presence known. A warning. Not aggressive, just clear. You're at the edge of acceptable range. Choose your next move carefully. By mid-August, the isolation was affecting me differently than I'd expected. Not loneliness, I prepared for that, but a constant awareness of being monitored, of sharing space with intelligence that was non-human but undeniably present, of living in a hierarchy where I wasn't dominant. I started having dreams, recurring theme, walking through high valleys, seeing them watching from peaks, feeling assessed, judged, not threatened, evaluated, like they were determining if I understood the rules, if I could be trusted. And in the dreams I always passed, always made the right choices, withdrew when needed, showed respect, and they let me stay. I mentioned this during a radio check. The dispatcher, an experienced ranger coordinator named Patricia Saunders, wasn't surprised. Everyone who works there dreams about them eventually, she said. Thomas did. Other rangers, the researchers who pay attention. It's like the mountains communicate the rules through multiple channels. Direct observation, traditional knowledge, and something else, something in your instincts. The part of your brain that evolved knowing we weren't always apex predators. That remembers when humans had to negotiate with larger, stronger things. The Torngats wake that up. In late August, I made a mistake. Not a protocol violation, but a judgment error that showed me how quickly things could go wrong. I was hiking a ridge on the western boundary, approved territory but close to a marked zone. The route followed a geological feature, dramatic cliffs with good visibility. I wanted to photograph the landscape for park documentation. Standard work. But I was so focused on the photography that I didn't notice how far I'd drifted north. Didn't realize I'd crossed into a transitional area. Not fully restricted but not comfortable either. I noticed the silence first. Birds had stopped. The wind had dropped. That particular quality of quiet that means something large is nearby. I looked up from my camera, saw it standing on an outcrop about 100 meters ahead. Just standing, watching me. It was massive. Over 3 meters tall, covered in dark brown hair, almost black, broad shoulders, long arms, face that was almost human, eyes, nose, mouth, but proportions wrong. Skull peak too. Jaws are too strong. Eyes that caught the light and reflected amber. It wasn't moving, just watching, waiting to see what I'd do. I remembered Thomas's protocol. Don't run. Don't approach. Make it clear you understand and you're leaving. I lowered my camera slowly, made brief eye contact, enough to show awareness, not enough to challenge. Then I turned, not my back completely, more of a sideways orientation, and walked at normal pace back the way I'd come. Not fleeing, withdrawing. I heard it move, not following, moving parallel, keeping pace as I descended. Monitoring, making sure I actually left. I kept walking, steady pace, showing I understood. After about 15 minutes, I felt the pressure lift. The sense of being watched faded. I looked back. It was gone, and I was well back into approved territory. That evening, I documented everything. The encounter, my error, its response, and I realized something. It had managed the situation perfectly. I noticed my intrusion, positioned itself to be seen, waited for my response, then confirmed my departure. No aggression needed, just presence, just the implicit reminder that this wasn't my space, that I was here by tolerance, not by right. I thought about the 3 missing researchers Thomas had mentioned. I wondered what they'd done differently. Probably pushed forward instead of withdrawing, tried to photograph or document instead of respecting distance, challenged territorial boundaries instead of acknowledging them. And the Tunneyat, patient up to a point, had enforced consequences. September came. The season was ending. The last research teams flew out. I began closing the station for winter. But I also started finding signs that the Tunnets were moving differently. More tracks near the station. More vocalizations at night. Closer than before. Not threatening, more like checking. Monitoring my departure schedule. Making sure I was leaving before winter sealed the park. One evening, 3 of them appeared on the ridge behind the station, just standing there, visible in the long twilight, watching me secure equipment, prepare for evacuation. I stopped working. I looked up at them, raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, just acknowledgement. We see each other. I understand. I'm leaving. They didn't respond, just stood for another minute, then moved away into the mountains. And I understood they weren't threatening. They were confirming. The seasonal human presence was ending. The mountains would be theirs alone again for 8 months. The hierarchy was returning to its natural state, and they wanted to make sure I knew my place in that transition. The plane came for me in mid-September. I flew out with all the documentation, official reports for Parks Canada, and Thomas's notebook now thicker with my entries, my observations, my growing understanding that the Torngat Mountains operated under rules that predated Parks Canada by millennia and would continue long after our administrative systems collapsed. I spent the winter in Nain, doing paperwork, training, attending meetings about park management, and saying nothing about the real protocols, nothing about the Tunniat, nothing about territorial negotiations that kept people safe, but couldn't be written into official policy, because the moment you formalized it, it became either sensational cryptozoology that no one would believe, or it became official species documentation that would trigger research protocols that would violate the understanding we'd maintained for generations. Better to keep it operational, ranger to ranger, guide to guide, knowledge passed through experience rather than documentation. The Inuit had done it that way for millennia. We were just learning their system, learning that some knowledge works better through practice than through publication. In April, I returned. The mountains were still locked in ice. The station was exactly as I'd left it. And within a day, I found fresh tracks near the perimeter. Large. Recently, they'd noticed my return. Were checking, determining if I remembered the rules, if I'd maintained the respect I'd shown last season. I did. For years now. For seasons. I've documented over 24 direct sightings, hundreds of tracks, countless nights hearing their vocalizations, and I've never been threatened, never been chased, never felt endangered, because I've followed the protocols, respected the boundaries, acknowledged that these mountains have layers of presence. Human presence is just the most recent, the most temporary, and the most conditional. The Inuit were right. They're not spirits, not monsters, just another person, older people, who've learned to share vast territory with the small, noisy humans who've arrived relatively recently, who've developed protocols that keep both species safe, who enforce boundaries firmly but fairly, and who tolerate our presence as long as we remember. We're not apex predators here. We're guests. Visitors granted access through centuries of negotiated understanding. Sometimes tourists ask me if I feel isolated, lonely, endangered out here. I tell them I feel the opposite. I feel like I'm part of something larger, an ecosystem with complex social rules, multiple intelligent species sharing territory through mutual respect. The Tunniat isn't a threat to me. They're neighbors. Powerful neighbors, territorial neighbors, but neighbors nonetheless. And like any neighborhood, it works when everyone knows and respects the rules. I don't know everything about them, don't know their population, their lifespan. Their culture is beyond what I can observe. And that's fine. They don't want to be studied, don't want to be documented scientifically. They want to be left alone in their territories, with occasional human presence in designated zones managed through understood boundaries. And that arrangement works, has worked for millennia, will work for millennia more if we maintain the wisdom to honor it. Parks Canada knows. The records exist. deep in archives, in ranger notebooks, in Inuit oral knowledge, in the accumulated experience of everyone who's worked these mountains and paid attention. But officially, we manage for environmental sensitivity, for cultural respect, for wildlife protection. And all of that is true. It's just not the complete truth. The complete truth is that we share the Torngats with something we don't fully understand. Something powerful, something territorial, and something that's taught us, humbled us into learning that our species doesn't dominate every ecosystem. That in some places we're the ones who need to ask permission, to tread carefully, to remember our actual position in the hierarchy. I'll work here as long as they tolerate my presence, as long as I maintain the respect, as long as I follow the protocols and teach them to whoever comes after me. Because this job isn't just about managing a park. It's about maintaining a relationship, a very old relationship between humans and the Torngats, between visitors and residents, between the temporary and the permanent. And every morning when I step outside the station and look at the mountains, I remember, I'm not the apex predator here. I'm not even in the second or third tier. I'm a small presence in an ancient landscape, granted access through protocols developed over millennia, tolerated by intelligence that was here first and will be here last. And that knowledge, that humility keeps me alive, keeps me respectful, keeps me in my place in the hierarchy that governs these mountains. The Torngat is real. They're here. They're watching. And as long as we respect that reality, we can coexist. The moment we forget, the moment someone decides human dominance applies everywhere, that our rules override their territory, that documentation matters more than respect, that's when the arrangement fails. That's when people disappear. That's when the mountains remind us firmly exactly where humans fit in the order of things. I've seen them dozens of times now, walking ridges at dawn, standing on peaks at sunset, moving through high valleys during migrations. And every time I feel the same thing: awe, respect, and gratitude. Gratitude that they've tolerated my presence, that they've let me live and work in their territory, that they've taught me what the Inuit have always known. Humans are not the measure of all things, not the center of all ecosystems, not the apex of all hierarchies. In the Torngat Mountains we're visitors, and the best visitors know when to arrive, where to stay, and when to leave. Know which territories are ours and which are someone else's. Know that dominance isn't our right in every space. And know that the most important thing we can bring to the wilderness isn't equipment or knowledge or research protocols. It's humility. The humility to recognize that we're not at the top, that we're tolerated, that our safety depends on respecting rules we didn't write, rules that were here before us, rules that will govern these mountains long after we're gone. The Torngat are the apex predators here, not us. And accepting that reality, really accepting it, not just intellectually but in your bones, in your instincts, in how you move through their territory, that's what keeps you alive. That's what keeps the arrangement working. That's what lets humans experience the Torngats without destroying the ancient balance that's maintained this ecosystem for 10,000 years, since the glaciers retreated and left these mountains to whatever was patient enough to outlast the ice. I'm a park ranger in the Torngat Mountains, and I guard this park not by dominating it, but by respecting what dominates me, by learning my place, by following protocols developed through generations of humans learning to live alongside something larger, something older, something that was here first. And every day I work here is a reminder. We are not the apex predator here. We never were. We never will be. And that's exactly as it should be.